controversial immigration law in Texas, SB4, is back in court today. A federal appeals court will weigh a legal challenge that targets migrants. The measure empowers state officials to enforce federal immigration rules. In this case, they would be allowed to arrest and deport undocumented people. The court will be weighing whether the Texas law conflicts with federal authority to enforce immigration policy. The implementation of SB4 has been on hold because the Biden administration sued, arguing Texas is stepping on the federal government's toes, so to speak. Many red states are watching carefully.
Meanwhile, former President Donald Trump resurrected his bloodbath comment from last month, this time aiming it at the situation at the southern border. The former president has criticized President Biden's immigration policies, and some have accused him of using dehumanizing language. Let's listen to what Trump had to say in response.
But I stand before you today to declare the Joe Biden's border bloodbath, and that's what it is. It's a bloodbath. They tried to use that term incorrectly on me 2 weeks ago. You know, it's all about misinformation. That's all they do is cheat on elections and disinformation, misinformation, fairly closely related, those two words. But they basically mean that it's all talk, but it's a border bloodbath, and it's destroying our country. It's a very bad thing happening. It's going to end on the day that I take office.
So this is a 10 out of 10 classic Trump troll to bring back the bloodbath language, knowing how much criticism he got. That was pretty bad faith when he used it before in a very specific context of talking about whether or not he approved of various it was a bloodbath for the auto industry is what he was talking about, and whether or not he should put tariffs on imports of cars from Mexico, et cetera. Now, very intentionally bringing it back to talk about the border crisis is a kind of a provocation. What do you make of it all?
Yeah, I mean, he's also running ads with that comment, and they're actually calling it Biden's border bloodbath now. That's sort of their campaign slogan. And I mean, I think he's smart to capitalize on it because immigration has now leapfrogged over the economy as the #1 issue for American voters. And they're not happy about what's seen as an increasingly chaotic situation at the southern border. There's been several high-profile murders committed by illegal aliens that, you know, obviously critics of Biden's border policy say wouldn't have happened if you had the ability to properly screen and process illegal aliens and remove ones who have criminal records. I mean, the case with Laken Riley's murderer, for example, he had been arrested several times previously but wasn't deported despite pretty much immediately breaking American laws when he got here, and ended up down in a sanctuary city in Athens, Georgia, where he went on to commit this murder. So there's sort of a direct line between some of these sort of soft on the border policies that Biden has implemented and that some Democratic leadership have implemented in states and localities that have prevented the ability to remove or even prevent people who do have a criminal history of entering the country illegally.
So that's not exactly what's at issue in this case, of course. The question here is whether or not the federal right to control border policy is being preempted by state policy. This whole situation really percolated largely because federal border enforcement, who have been for years the hero of the conservative movement, were saying that they weren't able to do their jobs because of border fencing that state officials in Texas had decided to put up with a lack of coordination in terms of their efforts. So this is a different kind of a question, which is whether or not it's going to be constitutionally prohibited for Texas to engage in a kind of border policy that interferes with the federal ability to police the border, and also whether or not this violates constitutional protections of Americans in the same way that the Supreme Court held that a very similar law in Arizona back in 2012 did. That law was characterized as a show me your papers law because it authorized police officers to basically do a kind of a stop and frisk on the basis of whether or not someone seemed to be a migrant to them and were forced to show their papers. And if someone was a legal immigrant who did not have their documentation on them, they also had certain rights to arrest and enforce and detain those people. Show your papers kind of evoking a kind of authoritarian state that many Americans pride ourselves on not having, or at least not wanting to have in the future. And obviously the implications for people who might look like immigrants, largely people who are Hispanic, are they going to end up being targeted by a policy like this, even though they are American citizens? I believe 40% of Texas is Latino.
Yeah, and so Texas's argument in this case will be about whether or not they have a right to basically take over some of the federal authority on immigration if they believe that the federal government is not enforcing existing law. And that's the argument they're going to make in court. I mean, one note on the Arizona case is that the Supreme Court did uphold the show your papers part, but they struck down the other portions that they believe had basically infringed too far on federal authority on immigration. Right now, this Texas case, which is, there's actually two, right? Because there is the one on the razor wire that made its way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that the feds could go in and remove it, but they said they didn't have any plans to, which is interesting. And then there's this other case, which is Texas they implemented a law that basically gives them the authority to detain and remove illegal immigrants that they find within their borders because they make it, I believe it's a misdemeanor for them to cross Texas state line illegally as opposed to just the American border more broadly. I don't know what the Supreme Court's going to decide on this. I know conservatives feel pretty confident that they will get that victory that they were hoping for back with the Arizona law.
Yeah, so there is a desire among the conservative activists that are advancing this case that it does again get kicked up to the Supreme Court, because the real win is not just winning in Texas, but getting the Arizona decision from 2012, the Supreme Court decision, overturned, really broadening the ability of states to do what they want to do in the immigration context. It also would be interesting to see if any arguments about whether or not these state laws can interfere on federal asylum policy by, say, deporting people who have a legitimate claim to asylum, subverting an asylum process, and basically undermining or kind of exploiting a real problem that we are currently experiencing, which is our asylum backlogs. So are we going to be in a place where instead of simply funding more administrative law justices who can vet these claims and then assess whether or not people should be deported or whether or not they have a legitimate claim to be here in the United States of America, as so many immigrants who've come to this country have done. Everybody in this country, obviously, except for Native Americans and Black Americans who were brought here not through immigration but through chattel slavery. Are we going to throw the entire kind of sweep of American history out of the door and allow states, individual states, to write their own immigration laws and erase those of which are kind of symbolized by the words in the Statue of Liberty?
Yeah, and I guess the question that they're going to be debating is whether or not it is creating their own immigration law to enforce what they feel the federal government's not enforcing. But on the asylum question, I feel like there's an easy solution to that, which, in terms of the backlog, which is the executive order that Biden was reportedly considering last month, according to a report from Axios, and some, I guess, abandoned, but it was one that the former President Donald Trump had put in place, which was if you don't claim asylum at a port of entry, then you don't get to have your case heard. So if you, for example, try to take advantage, let's say, of the asylum process, meaning you attempt to sneak past border agents in between ports of entry, and if you get caught, then you say, no, I'm here for asylum, and then you get a court date, you get released into the interior of the country. And it's essentially a loophole that people use so that if they are caught, they don't get immediately, go through expedited removal or otherwise get held in detention centers. I mean, it seems basic to me. You either declare in a safe third country or you make your asylum claim at a port of entry. But all of this stuff that's happening in between the ports of entry is what is really causing all of this chaos and this inability of border agents as well as the immigration judges to deal with this massive influx of millions that have come across since Biden took office.
Lots more to discuss there. We're going to move on to the next segment, but do stick around. We've got a lot more great rising coming up for you right after this.